Awesome. Well, here we go. Well, my guest today is Kimberly Horton. So, Kimberly, do you want to just start by just sharing a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. My name's Kimberly, and I am a recent graduate from George Fox University in this little town called Newberg, Oregon. We're like 45 minutes away from Portland. And I'm working as a software engineer for an education company that makes science equipment for classrooms.
Oh, very cool. So, are you kind of in that area still in Portland, or
Yes,
kind
yeah,
of
I live still
suburb,
in
I
the
guess?
Portland area.
Cool. Very good. Well, awesome. So, are you from Portland originally, or
It's a
again that
great
area?
question. I love to answer this one. So I was born up in the Seattle area, but when I was 11, I actually moved out to Malaysia.
Oh,
My grandparents used to be missionaries out there, and then I was sort of a missionary kid out there. My parents worked at a private Christian school there, and so I was there for my formative years, like middle school through high school, and I graduated there and didn't come back to live in the States until college.
oh my gosh, that's so interesting. So, have you heard the term like third culture kid? Would you consider
Yep,
yourself?
that would be a very accurate description of me.
Very cool. Awesome. So your family, your background is pretty much like missional, very mission minded, and kind of like grew up on a mission field, so to speak. So what was that like?
It was it was great. I loved it. It was definitely really formative to like things that I still find important today. I grew up in like a evangelical denomination called the Christian Missionary Alliance, and if you've heard of it, great job. Nobody has, but yeah, missions was always in the forefront of like the things that our church would talk about. It wasn't the only thing our churches did. I mean, it was, if you can picture like just any kind of like non-denominational evangelical church, that's what it was like. Maybe a slightly more conservative slant on theology, but there was just always this focus on like the globe and the world. And so it didn't run into the problems that I think some churches in the US particularly run into, of kind of being very small in the view of the world. Like we were constantly getting updates on like things that were happening to our missionaries who were like out on the field. And once I moved overseas, it was like you were always thinking about global politics and like global everything. And so that was a perspective that I really enjoyed growing up with. It was something that, I mean, it stuck with me today. I still really, really care about missions. It's just now in a more Catholic sense too, instead of just the Protestant missions world that I was really exposed to.
That's awesome. And how old did you say you were when you moved to Malaysia?
I was 11, so I started my sixth grade year out there.
Oh, okay. And how long was your family there?
So I was there for 7 years, and my parents just moved back to the States after I think 11 years, I mean, a little more than 11 years total of living out there. They just moved back in September. So now they are only 45 minutes away from me instead of like 48 hours, which
Amazing.
is great.
Wow, that's so interesting, that like that dynamic that you have in your family. So yeah, obviously you grew up really missional and, more of like a Protestant, even evangelical maybe background. So how did you become interested in Catholicism?
That's also a great question. It was a gradual journey. There's not an easy linear way to tell it, but I guess I can start my senior year of high school. So I mentioned I was in kind of like a essentially non-denominational feel kind of evangelical environment. I started moving in some more charismatic circles in my senior year of college, because my whole graduating class had this spiritual revival kind of experience. It was very cool. God worked in really cool ways that year. And as a result, I started running with a house church community that was quite connected to Bethel down in Redding, which is like about as charismatic as it gets in the US, if you've heard of Bethel.
Yeah.
And now basically all of the families that were involved in that church are now like living in Redding, like attending the Bethel Supernatural School of Ministry. So they're very, very off in that charismatic direction. And I am really thankful for that part of my life. I know I am really thankful that I'm not one of those people that got like some people are in those kinds of movements and they get really burned because they don't experience God at all. And they wonder like how people could be so crazy and like thinking that stuff you get a lot of like accusations of mental manipulation and like stuff that I think is valid in some cases. That wasn't the case for me. I did experience God a lot in that environment. And so one of the things that I was convinced of coming out of that is that God works in all sorts of spaces. And I'm grateful that I still have that with me. But
yeah, that's so true.
I also started realizing that there was something else I was struggling with. I didn't have a name for it until about a year into college. I struggle with something called scrupulosity or religious OCD. And I promise this is getting to the point of Catholicism and how I got interested in that. But I started realizing that some of those promptings and like things that I just felt like God was telling me in that charismatic setting, they weren't from God. They started becoming more and more irrational. And that feeling that I had always thought was God, I realized that's actually, some of that was OCD, and it was not from God. And I started feeling a lot of compulsions that were, the reason they call it religious OCD is that it's not, your compulsions aren't grounded in like just kind of general anxiety of like, oh no, like did I check the oven, or other kinds of common ones like that. They're always rooted in like whether or not you are a good person. So it's like, if I don't do this, I'm a bad person. I'm a bad Christian. And it can start out feeling normal. Like you're in a religious setting and stuff that you feel compelled to do or not do is just like super normal. But once it started getting kind of abnormal for me and I started feeling compelled to do stuff that wasn't moral or immoral, like this didn't happen to me, but like say I would feel like a bad Christian if I didn't go check the oven. That's not something I struggled with, but that's what it started. I started realizing, wait, the stuff that I'm ascribing moral weight to that I feel like God is telling me to do isn't moral like at all. Like it has nothing to do with morals. And so I started realizing something was wrong. And I really, really detached from like any emotional engagement with God in like a feeling it out kind of way. I was like, the heart is deceitful above all things, and therefore I'm not going to listen to it at all. And here's where Catholicism comes in. In college, this really primed me to be like very intellectual in my pursuit of faith and of God. So I never went through a period where I completely like stopped believing in God or like had any sort of wrestling like that. But I got very, very intellectual, like almost exclusively in the way that I was pursuing God and pursuing faith. And while I was at college, I was also in an honors program, which we also call like the Great Books program, where we read through over the course of 4 years. We read through all of the like the great texts kind of history. So like we started with Plato and Aristotle and like the Odyssey, and we worked our way up. So like senior year, we were reading like C.S. Lewis and Sartre and Freud and all sorts of like big, like really influential thinkers. And a large part of that was also theology, because a lot of history's greatest thinkers were also theologians. And we were also a Christian program, so of course we threw in extra theology. But let me tell you, the first semester of sophomore year was the medieval semester.
Okay.
And every medieval writer is Catholic.
Yeah.
So that is kind of where it started. It took me a little bit to get there, but here I am primed to just soak up only intellectualism and engage with God on that level. And then we are being given like Aquinas and Augustine and all these different theologians and thinkers. And then the semester after that, we got presented with Calvin and Luther and all of the reformers. And so it was just this really, really intense time of studying all sorts of early Christian thought, like from the early church fathers up to like the early reformers, and kind of getting all the different sides of the coin.
What a privilege. That is so cool.
Yeah. So I guess I would say, to answer the question, that is where my interest in Catholicism started. where one of the most influential texts that I think I've read ever is Augustine's Confessions. I think a lot of pivotal moments in my testimony kind of match up to a lot of pivotal moments of his, and I've always seen a lot of myself in him, and he is my confirmation saint now. But one of the moments that he has early on is this moment where he's speaking with a Catholic bishop, and he sort of writes, I came to the conclusion that the Catholic Church was at least not stupid. That's paraphrasing, but he just kind of has this like one sentence or two where he's like, so I realized that they actually weren't like dumb. They kind of like had reasons to think what they think. And I sort of had that moment in my sophomore year of college of realizing I don't agree with all of this. I definitely didn't agree with all of the Catholic theology that was being thrown at us. But I kind of came to this moment of like, well, they do have explanations that make sense for a lot of what they believe. And so that foundation was built of like being able to give Catholic perspectives the benefit of the doubt there of like, if somebody comes and says like, did you know that Catholics believe that Mary was without sin? Like normally your normal reaction to that as a Protestant is like, what in the world? Like, how could you possibly believe that? And that was still like my knee-jerk reaction. But after my experience reading all of this Catholic theology, it was kind of tempered where I was like, that sounds really outlandish, but I'm sure that they have a reason for that. And so I'm intrigued and I want to know more. And that's where I think the really like serious part of my journey started, was after I hit that point where there was that foundation.
Yeah, and so how did you feel about that, like, on an emotional level? It sounds like you kind of got to a place where you're like, okay, like, this makes sense. So I'm guessing you were kind of accepting of that, but was there, like, any, like, inner turmoil with getting to
that came a little bit later. This, for all of sophomore year and a ways into my junior year, I was just kind of curious. I was like, this is interesting. If you talk to anybody who comes out of that honors program that I was in, you can own, because I think there were moments in there where I was like, I don't know that I ever actually asked, like, do I need to become Catholic? But there were definitely like different doctrines that I started to really question, like especially the question of authority. It just started to not sit right with me that pastor of one church can exegete scripture and come to one conclusion. Pastor of another church can come to a totally opposite conclusion. And then you kind of have like no way to resolve that. That started to really bother me, but I didn't have an answer for it. So I had other questions kind of like that, where I was starting to feel bothered, but like Catholicism felt like so huge that I was like, well, that can't be the answer to this like one small doctrinal issue that I have. So I actually ended up I didn't get confirmed, but I started attending regularly an Anglican church, which seemed to answer a lot of my questions about doctrine.
For many people.
But there was still some discontent there with the Anglican Church, because I could still see, like, you've got your priests and you have your bishops in the Anglican Church, but then it's kind of like, where's the Supreme Court? Like, where do you take disputes if, like, two bishops disagree? And then I kind of looked over at the Catholic Church that had the Pope, and I went, that seems a bit extreme. Let's not go there. But I can jump into the emotional turmoil here, where that really hit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm really interested too, you know, well, yeah, take it in any direction that you'd like.
Yeah. So I'd spend a lot of time, I had questions, and I suppose there was like a certain amount of kind of, at one point I was like, oh no, like, do I have to think about this? And I think school just got really busy. I got really busy and I stopped thinking about it. There wasn't like a moment where I was like, okay, I'm at peace. I think I just kind of stopped thinking about it. In junior year, though, there was a very small group of Catholic students on campus, because we're a Protestant school, but there was a small like Catholic student club on campus, and they decided they were going to host a student-led Q&A And I was like, oh, that sounds fun. Like, I'll go. Because the topic was Mary, because that's probably one of the topics that Protestants have the most questions about when they start learning about Catholicism. And I was like, oh, that sounds neat. Yeah, I'd love to go see like what they have to say and what kind of questions other students are going to ask. But it was just this really casual decision of like, okay, I'm going to go and like show up and just kind of see. Like, we've never had any sort of like engagement with the other Catholic students on campus. My engagement was just reading a lot of Catholic texts with other non-Catholic classmates. So I was like, yeah, I'll go. And what ended up happening was I get there, students are asking questions, but the Catholic students who are like cradle Catholics don't really know how to answer the questions in ways that the Protestant students can kind of like understand, because they're coming from two totally different things, and the Catholic students don't have a good grasp on like, well, what perspective are they asking this question from? So I jumped in to like answer one of the questions. And then I think I jumped in for another one. And then people started directing questions just at me. So I'm sitting here at this Catholic student Q&A answering questions about Marian doctrine to other Protestant students. And at the end of it, I literally had a crisis. I was like crying, talking to these Catholic students, like, what do I do? I don't know what to do. Like, I had questions that they couldn't answer at the Q&A, and they were like, a priest is coming next week to campus. You could ask him if you wanted to. And I spiraled. Like, that night, I was like, oh no, I'm in way deeper than I thought I was. And all the emotional turmoil hit me like at once, because I had not realized how deeply I had researched myself into at least understanding Catholic doctrine until that moment where I realized not only was I playing devil's advocate, I didn't like 100% disagree with everything that I had been like answering. And so that launched me on, there is no simple way to kind of explain the next year or so, but I went through just periods of, I would research and research and research for months, and then I would be completely burnt out and like never want to think about Catholicism again. And then I would research and research and research and research, and then I would completely burn out. And that is where the emotional turmoil hit, was just essentially realizing how deep I was in all of it, like, too late.
That's amazing. So where did you go from there?
Yeah, from there, this is probably the hardest bit to kind of summarize well, because up to this point, there is kind of a clean path that I was following. But I was researching all sorts of things. I was listening to probably every Catholic podcast under the sun. I got a Twitter account. Like, I had one already, but I created a separate Twitter account specifically to interact with Catholics on Twitter, so that I didn't like freak out any of my friends on my main Twitter. And I started making friends on there and like asking people questions, and kind of went through a lot of different like categories of doctrines. So kind of like going through, okay, like, I agree with this. I guess I agree with this. I think the big one from that period of time was Sola Scriptura. I think I was listening to a podcast with Patrick Madrid, and he, in like one sentence, made me realize that like, you can't support Sola Scriptura. He's like, if you're saying that scripture is the only authority, you saying that is an external authority that's not in scripture. So like, you're already imposing another authority that's not scripture. And I went, oh no, I can't believe in sola scriptura anymore. And I had to like pause the podcast and just like sit there and wonder what I was going to do. The head of this it started coming to a head when I joined RCIA in the fall, but I still was really not sure what I was going to do. I joined it kind of knowing that I could drop out at any time. Like, I had to know that I was going to drop out at any time in order to feel comfortable going. And then it was just kind of this long process of like very, very, very intellectual thinking about it until I hit a wall, probably like in December or something. So like we're like in Advent, and I still haven't decided if I'm going to convert at Easter. And I hit a wall, and I'm like, God, I am so tired of this being completely intellectual. I need this to be emotional. Like, I need to want to become Catholic if this is like what you want for me. Because up until that point, I had described myself as kicking and screaming. Like, I did not want to convert. It felt so big. It felt so other from anything that my family was a part of. It felt different than like any of the paths that my friends had taken, because most of my friends were in this honors program and had kind of wrestled with Catholicism. So I had a support system of like people who knew people who knew where I was coming from. So I could talk about this with other people. I didn't feel completely alone, but nobody else had decided to take the plunge. It felt like it was just me. There were actually 5 of us in RCIA at that point. Like, there were other people who I converted in with, but it was this period of, I hit a wall. I was like, I can't do the only intellectual anymore. And God delivered. my heart started to change, but there was still something kind of holding me back. And I think the moment when I did decide to convert is really special to me. I met with one of the 2 Catholic professors at my university. They both taught in our honors program. And so I met with one of them and I asked her, I was like, I really don't know what to do. I feel really stuck. Like, there's something holding me back, but I don't know what it is. And she recommended me this Ignatian style of discernment, where you spend a period of time, usually like a day or a couple of days, living as though you made the decision one way. And then you spend the next day or so, like, living as though you made the decision the other way. So she's like, try living as though you have chosen to become Catholic. And then try living as though you've chosen to not become Catholic. And so I was like, that sounds like a great idea. So the next day, I decided, I'm going to pretend that I became Catholic. Or that, not that I became, but that I had, like, decided that, yes, this Easter I'm going to convert. And then the next year rolled around, and I didn't want to stop. I was like, I already know. Like, I don't even want to pretend like I made the decision to not, because, like, Peter's question to Jesus kept coming back to mind, where he says, Lord, to whom would we go? I was just like, where would I go if I didn't become Catholic? There is literally no other institution that, like, meets all of the theological requirements that, like, I now believe. There's nowhere else for me to go. And so it was just kind of, I never finished the discernment. I, like, never decided to pretend like I wasn't going to become Catholic. I just kind of quietly made the decision and was like, I guess I'm doing this. And after that point, I had total peace about it. And it was just kind of this beautiful wrapping up of my story of kind of, like, redeeming the emotional side of a relationship with God that I had really not known how to engage with for a long time. I was kind of, like, bringing that back of, like, yes, some people do convert, like, completely intellectually into Catholicism, but God made sure that wasn't what I did. He was like, he made me feel enough discontent to be like, yeah, I need to kind of redeem this. I can't just be somebody who read my way into the church entirely.
Sure. So what year did you enter the church?
This year, 2021, like this Easter on April 3rd, I think.
Oh, wow. So that's awesome. You're, like, in year 1.
Yeah.
So what has your experience been being a Catholic now?
It has been very calm. Like, I just told this whole, I didn't even get into kind of some of the nitty gritty, like, really things that I struggled with and pushed through, but it was such a long and hard journey of just really, like, wrestling with a lot of things, intellectually, socially, like, with none of my family is Catholic, and, like, that was a more difficult part of my journey. So now being Catholic, it's like, there's nothing to wrestle with anymore. And I still engage with and, like, am, like, an active member of the church. I go to church. I've been singing at Mass I'm helping lead that. And I still am very active on Twitter with a lot of the friends that I made on there. But there's no longer this drive to constantly be listening to podcasts and constantly be like inundating myself with information to like make sure that I'm making the right decision. There's just a lot of peace in that I've submitted to Christ. There's nothing else that I need to do. I don't need to verify. Like I did all that work. And so now it is just, really the best way I can describe it when people ask is like, it's very peaceful being Catholic. I am no longer intellectually agonizing over everything. I put in that work and now I get to just be with Christ.
That's awesome. That's so beautiful. Yeah. So you mentioned like some struggles there. Is there anything that you want to share of like something that was maybe one of those struggles and how you were able to work through that?
Yeah. I'm trying to think. A lot of it kind of blends together, or like it was really just me targeting specific issues and then really, really, really trying to figure out what I was thinking, what I thought about that. What it really ended up coming down to, the hardest issue for me, and it took me like a year to like properly wrestle with this, was the papacy. Because if you believe in the Pope and you believe that the Pope has authority, it literally doesn't matter what else you think about other doctrines. Like you have to kind of come under them if you believe in the Pope. And if you don't, then I would have probably become Orthodox. I actually had a number of friends convert to Eastern Orthodoxy as well. We had a very liturgical output in our honors program. So there would have been friends for me at the Orthodox Church as well if I'd converted in there. But it really came down to the papacy.
How did you kind of like get past that then, or what was there like a aha moment, or was it just kind of like coming to a point of acceptance?
There were a couple of aha moments. So the first one was I read Joe Heschmeyer has a book called Pope Peter. It was aggressive title and not a super aggressive book, but like it was a book that just really outlined like this is how we see Peter being the Pope, like in the Gospels and in Acts. This is how it goes through. I'm not going to do a good job of summarizing exactly how he does it because it's been a little bit since I read it, but I just remember being really impressed upon that Peter's like standing in the Gospels. He is the most prominent disciple, and I never saw that. I never saw... He is the one mentioned the most often. He asks all of the important questions. Every time he shows up in the Gospels, there is something really significant being pointed to. Like, every single time without fail. And there are all these little moments and stories that I, like, hadn't realized. Oh, like, that was just Peter. Or Peter is really significant in all of these... And so that book did a really good job of convincing me not actually of the papacy. So I'm sorry, I don't think that Mr. Heschmeyer completely did what he was trying to do with me. But I was at least impressed upon that Peter was like so important in the Gospels that I was like, how did I never see this before? But then really shortly after, and this is... convert bingo, see how long it takes for them to say Scott Hahn. I read a book by Scott Hahn, his book called Reasons to Believe. This wasn't one of his like classics that I think a lot of converts get recommended, but Reasons to Believe is this like apologetics basics book where like he starts at the beginning with like why you should believe in God, and then sort of like why Christianity, like why Jesus, and finally towards the end he gets to specifically like and then why Catholicism. But he outlines in this book this really compelling summary of how the kingdom of Israel in the Old Testament is a type or like a perfect representation of like what the church is meant to look like today. And that includes there being a pope. Like there's the king or the steward who's there to kind of fill in for while God isn't like actively here on earth. And I'm not going to do a good job of explaining it at all, but I read this book and I remember there was literally an aha moment where I think I literally shut the book and just sat there, with all my family was like reading books in the living room as well. And we were all kind of sitting around, and I just like shut the book and had to sit there and go, I have to become Catholic. Like that was the moment of kind of, it wasn't just the truth of like, oh, if you look at like these councils in history, like it was clear that the Pope existed from really early on, or even looking at like Peter and like, here's how Peter specifically functioned as the Pope. It was like that truth combined with the beauty of like that, the overarching metaphor of like God has been impressing visions and images and organizations to reflect what his church is meant to look like. And the only thing that fits that today is, in my mind, the Catholic Church. And so it was kind of like the truth and the beauty that ended up convincing me, and not just the endless research and podcasts and all kinds of reading.
Sure. So what would you say then to someone that's maybe in a similar place to where you were before and maybe considering becoming Catholic? What advice would you give to someone that's on that road?
My advice would be to not put yourself on a timetable. One of the hardest parts for me when I initially had the crisis at the Q&A event about Mary was realizing that like that was also back in like right before Advent started, I think. And I realized I was like, if I need to convert, like RCAA has it so that you have to convert in like at Easter. I only have like a few months to figure this out. And then what ended up happening was, I really think this was the Lord. I was approved to go study abroad that next semester. I was out of the country, like literally unable to convert into the Catholic Church at like the time everybody else does at Easter, or traditionally the time people convert in. People convert in at different times. But it was like I was literally unable to convert in while I was abroad for a lot longer than expected because of COVID. That's when COVID hit.
Sure.
And it was a good time, but it felt like God was saying, no, not only do I not think that you're like ready to convert, I'm like forcing you to take a break from all of this research and like all of the intellectualizing and panicking about it. And it was like, God knew that I needed time. It's possible that he could have, actually one of my friends who converted in with me became convinced of Catholicism and converted in with me in the span of like, I want to say like 6 months or less. Like it was very, very, very quick. It was less than that. It was 4 months. He joined RCIA like after Advent was over, and converted in at Easter. So some people are like that. Some people just get immediately convinced. But if you're in the position that I was in, which is just, you don't know, you don't want this to be true, or you don't really know what to think, and there is so much that you feel like you need to look into, and if you feel like overwhelmed like that, know that God does not want you to have to rush into making any kind of a decision. That even though it feels like, look, truth is hanging in the balance, like to a certain extent, yes, like there's always going to be objective truth that you need to figure out in different areas of your life. But one of the things I took with me also from my Protestant upbringing is it is so clear to me that God works everywhere. And anyone that tells you that if you don't convert into the church right now, like while you're researching it, like then your soul is in danger. That is just not true. Unless you are convinced right now, like you're sitting there and you're like, well, I know the Catholic Church is 100% correct. There is no doubt in my mind, and I am still not going to convert in. If you're doing that, that is the only time where you are in danger, because you're not following something that you know to be true. If you are still not sure like where you're at, or like what is true, or how to find how to find where God is leading you or where you're trying to go. Know that the only timetable that you are on is God's. You do not need to be converting in at the same time as everybody else if that feels like too much of a rush. And you do not need to like race to try to consume as much media and information as you can because you need to figure out what the right answer is. That was what made my journey so hard. And it's why finally at the end I could look back and see that, like, no, there were a lot of different places along the way that God kind of made me stop and like not rush into it, because there are some people who are built for just get all the information and then immediately convert in. And like, I watched that happen, but there are a lot of us who like, God knows you, and he knows that you're going to need time to have that percolate. So if you're trying to put yourself on a timeline of like knowing what the truth is and you have to know it, it's so much easier said than done. But I want to be the first person to tell you that you do not need to put yourself on that timetable. God knows how long it's going to take you to work your way into like where he's leading you and what the truth is. And he's not going to make you do that faster than he wants you to. So you have permission to rest and to take a break and to not burn yourself out.
That's beautiful. That makes me want to like be patient, even though I'm like not even converting. I'm like, okay, I'm ready to wait for God's timing. That's really beautiful. Well, this has been so great. Just to hear your story and kind of hear all the twists and turns. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so last question, where can people find you online?
Great question. So I mentioned my Twitter. I am pretty active over on my Catholic Twitter account. You can find me there at Kimberly Caritas. Caritas is Latin for, I believe, love. I should probably know that. I picked it because it rhymed, or it had consonants. And you can also find me over at my blog, which is just kimberlyhorton.com. And I'm in the middle of publishing a blog series over there, kind of going into more detail about some of the specific areas that I was starting to question on my journey, of just kind of a timeline of like, here is more information about like some of the more intellectual stuff that was going on as I was deciding whether or not I wanted to convert.
Awesome. Very good. Well, thanks so much, Kimberly, again for sharing, and thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, thanks everyone.